Okay, so open pedagogy. Let's just talk a little bit about it first, and then we'll talk about things you might be interested in. Let's keep it fairly informal. And let me get the whole screen there. So what is open pedagogy? I'll give you my definition of it. It's basically where students create rather than consume academic content. So they're actively engaged in creating something in which they're learning as they're doing, and they're creating some sort of a project that is shared. It could be shared with just the class, but it could also be shared more broadly. And many open education, open pedagogy projects are shared publicly on the web, and they remain after the class ends. It involves active learning, that students are learning as they're creating this material. And one of the things that tends to make open pedagogy project really effective is that so many of the assignments we give to students are, in the words of David Wiley, the founder of Lumen Learning and a founder of much of the open education movements in general, is that so many assignments are disposable assignments where students will write a paper or they'll take an exam, they'll submit them in online classes at least, or maybe more generally with all classes now, into an LMS. And then at the end of the term, the class closes and they lose access to everything they created unless they save a copy themselves. So, and even when you ask students, when you observe what students will do when they get a paper back, a lot of those papers they get back in the classroom end up being disposed of in the garbage as they walk out of the room, especially if they're not that happy with the grades. And they're not really used as much for future learning. And if they did well, they're happy, but they tend not to do anything more with it. And because when students are writing a paper, if they know that the only people who are going to see it are you and the student themselves and the instructor, it doesn't have quite the same sense of purpose or this, the same sort of creation in the global commons of knowledge that it might have if they're creating something that's shared more broadly. And open pedagogy, therefore, has this service learning part that they're doing something that might be valued by other people in the future. And that gives the assignments a little bit more worth, more intrinsic value, and more intrinsic motivation. Some very broad examples that have been used a lot is annotating online content. For example, Robin DeRosa, who we had on campus a couple of years ago, and she's been on the podcast, and we just invited her back. I'm hoping she'll come back on again soon. But she was having students use Norton's Anthology of American Literature and paying over $100 for a book. And she realized that every one of the things they were reading in the Norton's Anthology were public domain works, that all of that work was available for free. And the reason why she was using the Norton's Anthology version is because of the annotations provided. So what she decided to do, and she's done this a few times now, is she had students go out and gather the public domain works and annotate it themselves. So she had the students create the annotations while they were learning the content, while they were reading literature and discussing it. They were also providing public annotations, and they created their own textbook, which is shared publicly with any other class that might be interested in using it. And that work has been used as the basis of other instructors who took that content and had their classes improve it and change the mix of works that were included and to have a different focus, for example. So that's just one common example where people take work that's in the public domain or that's been released under a Creative Commons license, and they annotate it to provide some sort of addition to it, or to index it, or to catalog it, or to make connections across different concepts. Students can create blogs. They could have WordPress accounts or Blogger accounts or others where they're creating something that could be kept within the class. So they're sharing their reactions and thoughts of their learning journey, or we've had many people on our campus when they've had a class that's had a travel component back when people were traveling a bit more over the world. They create a class blog where students would post the reactions and post photographs and other things. But many people have used this. Gardner Campbell's done this many times to have students reflect on their learning journey as they're learning a new subject or new topic, where they can talk about their experiences and what they learned, how it changed their perceptions, and so forth. And just sharing that publicly, knowing that anyone in the world could read it, tends to give students much more of an interest or more of a stake in doing a good job with it. Wikis is another thing that many people have used. I did this for the first time about 15 years ago when we had someone leave the department, and we had no one to teach a history of economic thought class. So I put a class together, and I looked at the textbooks out there, and they were all really expensive. And many of the works were, 100, 200 or more years ago. And so what I had students do is read the online text, because there have been many collections of them out there. And I had, instead of them writing term papers that they normally do, where they describe a school of thought or contrast and compare the views of different schools of thought or different economic philosophers, I had them create, each student created 3 main wiki pages for either three economists or 3 schools of thought. I gave them a long list of them, divided them into 3 clusters based on the time period and so forth. And they created that, and then they had them share it with, well, it was shared publicly. And one of the things I told them is, this is out there, it's public, and anyone in the web could comment on it, including some people who are historians of economic thought. And I had a colleague who is an economic historian who did read them and provide some feedback on it. And they were really impressed to get some feedback by someone who's published quite a bit on the discipline. But there was also another example. This was one I heard on a podcast. I don't remember which school it was, but it was a class in Portuguese. It was a Portuguese language class, and it was in Texas, and I forgot which city. It may have been San Antonio. And what the instructor found was a Portuguese wiki that had an entry with very little information on the city of San Antonio. So he had the students create wiki posts on this wiki for the city of San Antonio, but it was being done entirely in Portuguese. So they were taking concepts they knew about and sharing it with a Portuguese speaking audience, which gave them, again, they were creating something that they thought was helpful because they're sharing information that they knew or that they had easy access to. And they were learning a language at the same time and, well, improving the skills. It was an upper level class, but it sounded like a really good project, and the students found it really engaging. We've had a couple of examples of student created glossaries. Maya in the theater department had created a glossary related to Shakespeare's, was it Shakespeare's sonnets? I forgot. No, it wasn't sonnets. It was,
No, it wasn't.
What was it? I don't remember now. Basically, it was a glossary of uncommonly used terms in Shakespeare's soliloquies, maybe, or
Probably, yeah, for her acting students.
it was definitely an acting class, but they were taking Shakespeare and coming up with glossaries for some of the terms that would not be familiar to people in modern English, or that the meaning would not be obvious. So she had students do this. Student podcast projects are really popular. I've done one 3 semesters now in my my introductory and labor economics classes. At Vanderbilt University, they've been doing this for 2 or 3 years, maybe 4 years now, where many classes do this. And then they have a Vandy Vox podcast that takes the best podcast from each class and broadcasts that on a general stream out to a broader audience. Well, an audience that's more likely to listen to the best of the Vanderbilt student podcast rather than all of them from within a given class. One of the things my students have really liked about this is that they get to share it with their friends and with their parents, and showing them, that they've actually learned something that has some usefulness. Student created videos is another thing where students could create videos where they're explaining concepts. It could be tutorials, they could be demonstrations, they could be interviews that they do, and they can share those either within the class or publicly. And I've had I've used this for many years, actually, in my large class. as an alternative to some other types of assessments, or as a grade replacement type project. I had to cut it back because it got to the point where I was getting the last time I did it, I had 120 videos all come in the last week or so of the semester. They were all 5 to 10 minutes, but when there's 120 of them, that really adds up into a really long time. And I just couldn't keep up with that. So I really enjoyed that, but and the students enjoyed it. And I still have a collection of some really nice videos they created. But it just wasn't sustainable on my end. But in a smaller class, that can work really well. Many people also have their students do research projects that they then share publicly, where they have their papers. Now, one issue is some of these do become the basis for other people's submission in other classes and other schools, but because they're published on the web, it's pretty easy to track that. So, but students are generally pretty proud to share their work on, their research or projects. You could also have students create books. I've had students do this the last 3 years in the capstone course in economics, where there was a semester-long project. Students broke up into groups of typically 3 students. There were a couple that had 4, and ultimately one ended up with 2, but they didn't want to regroup when one student dropped out of the class. And they created, a book on a topic that they found interesting each year. It was a different topic each year. There was a case in Jessica, I know her last name, I can't think of it right now. She teaches a wellness course at SUNY Buffalo, and I feel really bad, I can't think of her last name at the moment, but she had 3 books she wanted to use for this class. It was a new class she was teaching. There were 3 books that she wanted, but none of them covered all the topics. So she really wanted to have like all 3 books, but each of them was like $150 to $200 each. And she didn't want to charge students like $500 or $600 for the books. So what she did instead, she had about 100 students. She had them write their own book as they went. She broke up the topics and she assigned them to groups. I think they were like 7 or 8 students, maybe 10 students in a group. She gave them a breakdown of when they were due, and she created the first part of it. But then from then on, students were responsible for writing their own textbook that was shared with the whole class before, and she gave them feedback all the way through, but it was shared before they were actually discussing it. So they were writing the book as they went, which was an interesting process and a very successful project. She was able to get some funding to give them all a printed copy of that at the end of the term. And there's a nice picture of 100 students all holding up the copy of the book they created. So the main reasons, and I think this is implicit in what I've been suggesting, is, there's a lot of motivation when students have this non-disposable assignments. The public audience aspect of it is something that students really appreciate, that they're sharing something, that has some value. It involves active learning. And I already said all those things, didn't I? Okay. But, the main thing is you should do it so that it's aligned with your course. Don't just do it for the fun of it, although students will find it to be fun. But, find the things in your course outcomes that projects might work. One concern that always comes up when people talk about open pedagogy is, well, what about those students who don't want to share the work? Basically, you have to provide some mechanism for that. That hasn't been a problem in my capstone course because of luck or chance, but there are students who might be, for example, undocumented, or there may be students who have, who are facing problems with someone who's stalking them, or there may be problems, or there may be other reasons why they don't want their work to be public. And there's a number of ways of dealing with that. With the podcast project, I gave students the option. In 2 of the classes, they all created podcasts, but when they submit it, they're given the option of either sharing it on the public stream or only sharing it within the class. And about half of them chose to share it publicly. Half of them chose to do it within the class. And some of it is they just didn't feel comfortable sharing it publicly. But you want to allow for students who have any concerns about public information being posted about them. Now, in many cases, you could also use pseudonyms. Yeah, Karen. You're muted.
No, I was going to ask about why can't they do it in a pseudonym? So keep going. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I was a little too hasty.
Oh, no. Yeah. So you could use a pseudonym, or, or they, yeah. Or it could even be listed as anonymous, that when Gardner Campbell mentioned, when he gives students the option when they do their blog post of leaving it as anonymous for the post. So as long as he has some way of accessing it, but they submit the URLs and so on, so he can see what they're doing. And there are lots of ways of addressing it, but if students really feel uncomfortable, there's always other ways of doing it, and anonymity is probably the easiest way. When students are working on a group project, it's important to have a good process for collaboration. Groups can work well when there's good processes to encourage them to work well. One of the things I've done when I've had students do this is, for the first meeting of the group, to come up with essentially the group rules, or group charter, in a sense of how they're going to work, how they're going to allocate tasks, how they're going to how and when they're going to work together, what type of medium are they going to use, are they going to meet? Well, this was mostly done, it was either done before the pandemic or entirely during the pandemic, where when it was meeting in class, they were given the option of meeting online if they wanted to, or they could all meet in one place. Some of them chose to meet on Zoom even before we went remote, before that was even a likely prospect. But I basically just opened my room to them, because I've been using Zoom for about 6 or 7 years, well, since it started, pretty much. And I just left it open. And I had students going in at 2 or 3 in the morning just to work, because that was the time that worked for them in some cases. And, just giving them time to process, to work out how they're going to do things and how they're going to resolve any difficulties if someone appears to be shirking or whatever. And that's generally worked pretty well, as long as they're given some guidance and they formulate a plan and that they buy into. You also want to make sure there's some sort of feedback, because student work could be really good. It might need a little bit of work or polishing. And, a really effective way is to use peer feedback. You can provide feedback too, but leveraging the rest of the class can be really effective too. One challenging issue always is the issue of copyright and intellectual integrity. One interesting thing, though, is that most people have found that open pedagogy projects are much less likely to involve academic integrity violations than other types of work, because if students know that they're posting something on the open web that anyone can find, they're much more careful about not just copying and pasting from other people, because they know that they could get called on it or get caught on it at some point. And they also take a bit more pride in projects that they had a say in shaping. One thing that's an issue is coming up with a way of hosting it. If you're going to post it on the web, you need some place to post it. And one challenging thing is that if it's posted on, for example, Blogger or something similar, if you have student blogs, those will go away when the students leave or when their accounts expire if they don't maintain that beyond the campus. One of the things I've been careful about is, with these projects, I've been using platforms where the projects will be out there for a long term. For the student books, I've been using Pressbooks, which basically allows them to continue to stay published as long as the Pressbook server is still in existence. And it's been growing quite a bit, so I'm not too worried about that. For the podcasts, I've been posting them on a podcast server where I actually paid for the license for it, but you don't have to pay. I already had an account with them. It wasn't that more difficult to add another one. But you want you need to find a way of where you're going to post it so that it will be accessible if it's designed for public consumption. You have to have a way of evaluating individual contributions. And in my case, for the book project, it was pretty easy. Well, I was worried about that because everything was jointly written by the groups. But what I did is something that Jessica had suggested when we talked to her about her project on the podcast a while back. And what she had them do, and it's worked really well for me, is just have them each write in a different color in a Google Doc. You can always look at the edit history, but I had them each pick a color, and at the top of the document, it was an ongoing document they worked on all semester, they just put their names in the color that their text was marked as. So they just select the text, and that it was pretty easy to visually see the individual contributions whenever I was looking at it. And I gave them assessments and feedback on that at each stage. And sometimes the assessment was, you really need to get going a little bit more here. You know, you've got a good start, but you need to flesh these out quite a bit more for the next draft. But you need to find some way of doing that. And in my case, the colors were pretty easy. The podcast was not very difficult either, because with that, I got to hear their individual voices. Now, I'm assuming that they all wrote their own contributions, or if not, maybe they generally ended up doing it mostly free form. Some use scripts, but in general, they actually did a pretty good job with it, and I wasn't really too worried about it. There were a few people who didn't contribute quite as much, but that was pretty apparent. And I gave them feedback in stages, and if they weren't happy with their evaluation, they got to redo it as many times as they wanted to. And usually the second time was more than enough to clear up any problems. You want to make sure anything you create is accessible, you know, that you meet all accessibility standards, because if you're posting things on the public web, you want them to be readable by anybody, or, you know, everyone can consume those. So, you know, if you're doing videos or podcasts, you want to make sure that there's captions. If you, in the case of students with a book, I had to teach them a little bit about using a heading structure and using, you know, heads and subheads and, you know, A, B, and C level heads for that. And one of the things we did each time is we met and we talked about what sort of heading structure they wanted throughout the book, so it was consistent across all the chapters. The other thing you need to address if you're going to post things from your students is the form of licensing. Most open pedagogy projects involve some form of Creative Commons license. If there's no licensing statement put on, then by default, it's the usual, you know, all rights reserved to the original author. Although once things are on the web, that kind of breaks down anyway. But CC BY is the most open form of Creative Commons license, other than a public domain license. And CC BY basically means that anyone can use a content as long as they attribute it to the original author. So people can take things that you've done and remix them as long as they give you credit for your contributions. The next most each one here is getting a little bit more restrictive. The next one is it's CC BY, but it's share alike. So whatever conditions are made, whatever restrictions are made, must be made in any derivative work. With just a CC BY, commercial publishers could use it, or other people could use it. But with the CC BY license, if you release something with a CC BY license, CC BY SA license, a share alike license, then it can only be used in work that is also subject to a share alike license. So it basically is restricting other users to also release it under a CC BY license if they're going to use it. So it can't end up in a textbook. It can't end up in a commercial application unless they release it free for anybody. Your mic, you're muted, Karen.
Oh, no, this is just me gesticulating. I'm sorry. No, that's really important. That would be important for my students in the projects that I'm thinking about having them doing. They wouldn't want someone else profiting from it. So I'm trying to remember that. That's just me.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry.
And CC BY ND is no derivatives. And what that means is a work cannot be changed. It has to be preserved in the existing format. That's most commonly used with artistic pieces and videos or photos and so forth, because basically what it's saying is you can use this photo as long as you provide attribution and you don't change it. So you don't draw faces on it, or you don't, you don't cut and paste or add other images to it. And again, that's normally with, artistic expression of some form. The next restriction is anyone can use it as long as they don't make money for it and they give you credit for your work. So that means other open pedagogy projects take your work and build on it as long as they're not going to sell it to anybody. And then you could combine those to add the non-commercial and the share alike restriction, which means anyone else can use it as long as it's not for business and as long as it's also released under a non-commercial share alike license for any derivatives. And the last one, which is the most restrictive, is you attribute it, you can't use it for commercial applications, and you can't create derivative work. And they're all here at creativecommons.org/licenses. What I normally do is I'll talk a little bit about this, share with the students, let them discuss it, and then decide. And in each of the book projects, they chose the CC BY options. They weren't really worried about people making money off of their work or other people using it. In fact, they were kind of flattered by the notion that maybe they've done something that other people might want to use. As long as they're going to get credit for the work, they were pretty pleased with it. So I was really happy that they chose that. But again, I would have been happy if they chose any of those. And here, there's a sample student release form. Let me get the URL for that and put it in chat. To be honest, I haven't done this, and I probably should, just because, while students agree to it verbally in a class, they might decide they don't want to do that at some point in the future. And, having them sign the agreement, gives you a little bit of cover. My classes, they work really well as a group, and I didn't have them do the formal release, but this is a sample student release form. I forgot who created it, so that's probably a best practice to do, that once they decide on the license, get them to sign a release stating what it's released under. And however you do it, the creativecommons.org has embed code where you can embed the restrictions right in the document as an image with the appropriate alt text, so that, whatever form it takes, you have the license right there. So that's my really quick spiel. We can go over some specific examples, but what types of things are you thinking about doing or might you consider doing?
My students have to create original teaching units, units and lessons and the supporting materials. And I was thinking about already, we had talked together as a class about, sharing with each other, but then why not just put them on, a website? Here's all the activities that 206 did in 2020, 2021, here's all the ones.
Mhm.
So this whole, and we do have a couple of vendors in our discipline who like to take teacher work and commercialize it, so that non-commercial attribution, whatever, I have to go back to that slide.
Yeah,
but,
the NC and then non-deriv, probably the ND.
I don't think it would be a problem to have derivatives, because
Okay,
one
so
of the
the
ideas
NC.
is we want other teachers to take it and improve it and then share it back. So I want the share alike, but I want the non-commercial.
Yeah.
Because then it can be sort of a hub where, okay, you did this, but now I've added this element, and oh, that makes it so much better. So really to make it an open source curriculum development site kind of thing.
Yeah, no, that would be really good. And there's a number of projects like that where some, I can't think of his name. His Twitter handle is that psych professor. He works a lot with Robin DeRosa. And what he's had students do is create test banks, basically, that are then shared publicly. Or, there was another example of this I heard on a podcast, again, on teaching in higher ed, where she was interviewing someone who was teaching a chemistry class where students were creating videos in Flipgrid that were designed for students in a high school chemistry class. And again, they were creating something that were then shared. And I don't remember the license type that they were released under, but it's probably one of the Creative Commons licenses. Judy, were you thinking of trying some? You're muted.
Oops. Yeah, I know. The lucky thing is all I do is project-based. But what I'm trying to do is we have a lot of minors who take my class, and I want them to be able to apply what they're doing. How would it help them in their major? So Karen, if you don't know, I run the costume shop for the theater department. Best kept secret, I tell you, on campus. And I have a lot of chem majors and STEM majors and meteorology majors. And they're like, what is sewing? You know, we want to have fun. I said, yeah, but do you know, physics majors, we talk about tensile strength of thread. And they do projects. I'll get tech ed students in who need to know fabrics, textiles, because they're going to do hammock chairs. And they have to know how to sew it properly. So I'm trying to get these students to pick one small project, not their final project, and relate it to what their major is. So if I have a early ed major, they're going to, and I've done this with them, make little books for hands-on learning for children, how to tie a tie and how to zip a zipper. And so they make those. And then my students who are working with at risk or disabilities know that they can make that same book for their project. So I'm more looking at this is not just project-based learning, because that's what I do, but the application of, we're just not going to do a whole bunch of samples of stitches and call that a project. It's putting it to something. So, and I have them journal, but a lot of this is, I would love them to not only send me the pictures like online, what they've done the past year and a half. It's just send Judy all the pictures of their projects while they're doing it online. I want to be able to have them send them out to other students, make them available. Of this is just because it's sewing in the theater and costume construction. I'm a physics major and I figured out how to make a sail on a boat that'll actually float at X miles an hour,
And that could be done through a blog if you want to do it in some, it could be a WordPress thing. You could use Blogger right in the Google Apps. Or you could have students create videos where they're explaining all these things and so forth. And they tend to enjoy doing it. And pretty much all students have smartphones, so. So
all of the smartphones, yeah.
Now I'm going to share a resource that has a lot of resources. I do want to get more of them on here, but Judy Littlejohn and I first did this. We did a series of presentations at Disney World, actually. At the OLC, the online learning conference that happened to be located at Disney World, right near Epcot. Actually, we could walk across to it after the sessions. But this session, this page we put together for a session there on open pedagogy projects. And this describes much of what I talked about here, but it also has a lot of resources on open pedagogy and open pedagogy. This section is really where we put most of the materials together. It's on a website that I host. And for example, for everything I think I got all, I left a few out. There are some links to examples. If you just click on it, it gives you links to applications that people have used. And it will also give you some resources on either some research on it or podcasts discussing it, or in some cases, it will have a link to the tools that you might use. This is an interesting one. At FIT, they have a fashion history timeline project where people will, and that would certainly apply, where people take a particular style or type of fashion and they create posts about that. And I think, do I have that on here? But this is actually here's a video where they describe it. So we don't need to see the whole video, I suspect, especially since I don't have the audio turned on. But, there's a lot of resources in here, and e-portfolios we didn't talk about, but that's another place where lots of people have used open pedagogy because, it's related, but you could have students create portfolios of artwork or of their research or of their writing. If they're doing creative writing, they can have a variety of genres they post on. And that generally goes across multiple classes, but having an ePortfolio platform either for a class or in a department or a school could be really useful. And some schools have adopted this very heavily. The next session is actually on the SUNY Create project, but that's an instance of the domain of one's own project that was first developed at University of Mary Washington, where they adopted a partnership with Reclaim Hosting, where each student was given their own domain, where students could host their own WordPress site, they could host their own web servers, they could host their own, well, they could create their own discussion forums, wikis, or other things. And students basically got the domain when they were freshmen. They got to use it through all 4 years of their institution. And a common use was for students to create their own websites and archives of their work or samples of the work that they could then transfer over when they graduate to their own domain. And the domain of one's own project, it was free for the students while they were students, but once they left, for $25 a year, they're given, I believe it's 10 gigabytes of data, and I think that's pretty much the only limitation. And basically, they can port everything over to their own domain, and they have it going forward. So they can have a nice little portfolio illustrating what they've done. Students in computer science would create samples of some of their code that they've done or some of their projects, some of the applications. People in art would post artwork. People in writing, would post some of their best writing samples. People would post their research in other disciplines. And it became a nice little platform, which also helped provide a nice transition to careers often, or for grad school, where people would have portfolios they could share, with the grad schools they were applying to. Podcast we talked about, remixing, annotating online content we talked about. There's some specific examples of service learning. This is one that Judy, actually, we were co-presenting this. She used in her class where we talked about it. Sorry, I don't have a link to that because she had just described it. She was doing a project with WikiEDU, where you work with Wikipedia, and basically they provide a class group for your class to do some development work in Wikipedia on a specific range of topics. Here's an interesting one at the Smithsonian, where they have volunteers transcribing historical documents into, and so, they have volunteers doing transcriptions, but for people doing history, that could be kind of interesting. For example, there's National Archives have a similar project. And here, these were all transcription examples, but they had people volunteering at the Indiana University transcribing historical documents. And here's some examples of student created. I guess we didn't find any at the time. There are some out there. We got tired. Here's some student created books, some of the early ones. Oh, and Jessica Kruger is right there. And here's the book that her students created. And here's Robin DeRosa, and here's my first class one. I've got to update this with the 2 more recent ones. Here's some examples of student video projects and some resources on that. And so forth. And this was when I was a chair of the Fact 2 group, the first time I put together a task group on open pedagogy, and they created this project, which has created links to projects throughout SUNY involving open pedagogy. This is a group of people. Robin DeRosa is one of the organizers, as well as that psych professor who does the open pedagogy student questions projects, as well as many others, where anyone interested in open pedagogy can post comments. It's a blog and so forth. There's lots of good examples there. And each of these has some really good stuff on them. And if you find any other resources, you can add it. And as soon as things lighten up and we get a chance, we'll update this. We haven't done much of an update for about a year or so, simply because it's been a rough year. So these are the things, there's a lot of good examples, and students really appreciate having some say over what they get to create and how they do it. And they take ownership of it. My class, my capstone course, when we went remote, it was the only class. Well, let me rephrase that. Most of my other classes, I noticed a significant difference teaching remotely from being in person. This class really maintained the same energy and enthusiasm when we went remote as we did before, partly because many of them had been working remotely with each other anyway. And this spring, I taught another version of that class, and that class was probably one of the best I've ever taught in terms of student engagement, enthusiasm, and excitement. And a lot of it was they got to pick the topics they were writing about, with discussion. They came up with a lot of good ideas. The last 2 years, they picked topics that were that they all agreed on. This year, they couldn't come up with one topic. Going back, 2 years ago, they focused on income inequality. Last year, they focused on reasons for wage differentials. It was a similar topic because they first came up with things they wanted, and then they tried to see if there was a general theme where they could all fit it into that. This year, about half of the class wanted to do something about the impact of COVID, and the other class wanted to have any topic other than COVID. So they just picked current topics or economic issues for 2020, 2021. But that's all I've got for this. So any questions, anything I can help with, or give you some suggestions on resources for?
No, this has been helpful. I especially appreciate the part about the commons licenses and then this other resource of examples. And I am attending the next one about the SUNY Open, whatever it's called.
The SUNY Create, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you,
Yeah.
Tom.
Yeah, for the past couple of workshops with you, the same term keeps coming up, Flipgrid, which I've never heard of before this year. So I'm hoping to learn something about it maybe in the next session.
Well, actually, if you let me stop the recording. I almost